Hi, and welcome to 10-Minute Neuroscience. In this installment, I'll be covering the neuroscience of reward and addiction. When I use the term reward, I'm referring to an experience the brain tags as important and worth repeating. That can be something that's pleasurable, but it can also be something that provides relief from stress or anxiety. So while pleasure refers to how good something feels, reward is how strongly your brain learns to seek it out again, or how reinforcing it is. And those are two similar but slightly different characteristics. Addiction is when the brain's reward system learns to treat something as unusually important, which can cause someone to obsessively crave it and compulsively seek it out, even when it could actually be doing harm. It's important to mention that reward and addiction are complex phenomena and not fully understood, and they can be influenced by many different factors, including genetics, environment, stress, and so on. I won't be able to cover all of that in this video, so I'm focusing specifically on the brain mechanisms underlying rewarding experiences and how the brain changes during addiction, often in ways that perpetuate addiction. As I mentioned, our understanding of this is still evolving, but what I'll discuss here aligns with current research. I may use examples of drugs, including alcohol, throughout this video, but it's important to point out that many of the same mechanisms I'll discuss are thought to apply to behavioral addictions like gambling as well. In other words, I'll be describing a general framework for the neuroscience of addiction, not something that is specific to any one drug or behavior. Addiction involves long-lasting changes in brain systems related to reward, motivation, learning, and self-control. These changes can increase cravings for drugs, make drug-related stimuli more powerful, weaken the brain's ability to inhibit impulses, and reduce sensitivity to everyday rewards. To understand how this happens, let's start by discussing dopamine. There's a region in the brainstem called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, and it's one of the two largest dopamine-producing areas in the brain. The cell bodies of these dopamine neurons are found in the VTA, but their axons stretch out or project to various other brain regions. One of the regions these neurons project to is the nucleus accumbens, which is a collection of neurons found deep within the brain in an area called the ventral striatum. When we experience something rewarding, these VTA dopamine neurons are often activated, and they release dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Most addictive drugs, either directly or indirectly, increase dopamine signaling in this circuit, raising dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens. This pathway from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens is a major part of what is known as the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway also extends to various other brain regions, including the amygdala and hippocampus, and it's heavily involved in motivation, reward learning, and the process of assigning importance to rewarding experiences and the cues that predict them. The VTA also sends dopamine projections to parts of the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, and this route is known as the mesocortical dopamine pathway. While the mesolimbic pathway is more closely tied to motivation and reward learning, the mesocortical pathway is more involved in functions like decision-making, impulse control, and regulating behavior to be in line with long-term goals. Together, these pathways help determine not just what we're motivated to pursue, but how well we're able to control that motivation. In addiction, we tend to have increased motivation to seek out drugs driven in part by dysregulated dopamine signaling in the mesolimbic circuitry, while the mesocortical pathway may become dysregulated in ways that impair the control of behavior. So these are two of the major dopamine pathways in the brain, but what exactly does dopamine do when it comes to reward and addiction? Well, when scientists discovered that addictive drugs cause dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, many of them made the logical assumption that dopamine must be what causes pleasure. And this understanding of dopamine has now become pretty widespread in our culture. But interestingly, most neuroscientists no longer think dopamine is actually the primary cause of pleasure, even though it is correlated with pleasure. And that's because there's a good amount of evidence to support the idea that dopamine isn't the main pleasure-causing substance in our brains. One way to put it is that dopamine seems to be more tied to wanting than liking. It helps create craving and motivation to pursue something instead of the pleasurable experiences themselves. Truthfully, there probably isn't just one pleasure-causing substance in our brains, but the neural mechanisms of pleasure still aren't fully pinned down. Modern research, for example, points to an important role for the endogenous opioid system, but that's an evolving area of research. But if dopamine doesn't cause pleasure, then why does it rise during rewarding experiences? Well, one of the best supported ideas is that dopamine acts as a teaching signal. Dopamine signals are strongest when we encounter something that we find to be better than we expected it to be. In this way, dopamine essentially can act as a signal that helps the brain learn the details of whatever led to the unexpectedly positive experience. This hypothesis is often referred to as the reward prediction error hypothesis, and this type of signaling might have evolved to help our brains find their way back to positive or beneficial things. This model might help to explain some aspects of addiction by helping us to understand why the brain can sometimes place such a high value on something like a drug. Perhaps it can be linked to dopamine release during early experiences with the drug, which can create a persistent high value for the drug that the brain has difficulty unlearning, if you will. In this sense, we can think of addictive drugs as hijacking neural circuitry that might have originally evolved to promote survival. As I've mentioned, we think that dopamine is involved with assigning value not just to a drug itself, but to any cues related to a rewarding experience. And when I say cue, I just mean anything that our brain recognizes as being associated with the drug. That could be things in the environment, sensory experiences like the taste or smell of the drug, particular emotions, and so on. We think dopamine is important in identifying those stimuli and making sure we recognize them as important or salient, thereby increasing motivation to use those cues as signposts that lead us back to the positive experience. So in this sense, dopamine is not just involved with deeming the cue as valuable, but in initiating the seeking out of the cue or the experience it is associated with. Neuroscientists call that cue-triggered motivational pull incentive salience, and it involves cues that become attention-grabbing, making you want the reward. So if you have someone who has a positive experience their first time drinking alcohol, for example, the brain likely released dopamine in response to the experience because the experience was more rewarding than expected. Additionally, the dopamine released may have helped the brain to make connections between the positive experience and any other cue present at the time, including the place the alcohol was consumed, the people someone was with, the taste or smell of the drink, and so on. With repetition, these cue associations don't just become stronger in a psychological sense, they become wired in through changes in synaptic strength across a network of regions. And as these associations strengthen, the cues themselves can begin to activate dopamine signaling and motivation circuits even before any alcohol is consumed. Over time, circuits that attach emotional meaning and memory to the drug experience become more efficient at activating the nucleus accumbens and related areas, so cues can trigger motivation, attention, and craving quickly and powerfully. Because of this, we can describe the reward system as becoming hypersensitive to drug-related cues. As drug use is repeated more and more, control of the behavior can shift from circuitry involved in voluntary behavior towards circuitry involved in habitual behavior, making the behavior feel less like a deliberate choice and more like a default routine. This shift is associated with the increased recruitment of a pathway called the Nigrostriatal dopamine pathway, which originates in a brainstem region called the substantia nigra and projects to a part of the basal ganglia called the dorsal striatum, which is implicated in habits and compulsive behavior. The recruitment of this circuitry creates a habitual response that contributes to the compulsive aspects of addiction. This helps explain why craving often feels automatic and sometimes difficult to control. For example, finishing work, walking into a familiar bar, or feeling stressed in the evening might trigger a strong urge to drink, not because of a conscious decision, but because the brain has learned that these cues predict something valuable, and it has started to trigger motivational processes as soon as it is exposed to those cues. Of course, this type of neural activity perpetuates addiction, as it can very powerfully motivate someone to seek out a drug. In fact, some research suggests this motivation can start to increase even before someone is consciously aware they've been exposed to a drug cue. Another component of addiction involves changes in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is important for judgment, planning, and impulse control, among other things, and imaging studies in people with addiction show reduced activity in key regions of the prefrontal cortex during tasks involving self-control and decision-making. This matters because the prefrontal cortex normally helps us resist urges, weigh consequences, and prioritize long-term goals over short-term rewards, all things that are critical for making the types of decisions necessary to remain abstinent from a drug. And parts of it seem to be less active at times in someone who is addicted. This reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex is called hypofrontality, And the current evidence suggests that it isn't caused by one single change, but instead emerges from multiple drug-induced adaptations that affect prefrontal brain networks over time. So as someone engages in addictive behavior, their brain begins to change in ways that make the person more likely to continue engaging in that behavior. The hypersensitivity of reward circuitry and the phenomenon of hypofrontality are two examples of this. And these changes are associated with the state we refer to as addiction, which involves obsessive cravings, compulsive behavior, and general difficulty controlling behavior. Of course, as someone uses a substance, there are often other adaptations that occur with chronic exposure to the drug. For example, there may be changes in receptor levels and signaling pathways that cause the drug to produce a smaller effect, a phenomenon known as tolerance. This means that someone needs more of the drug to produce the effect they desire, which often leads to escalation of drug use, and that may worsen many of the addiction-related brain changes I've mentioned so far. At the same time, the brain's reward system, despite remaining hypersensitive to drug-related cues, can become less responsive overall. Dopamine responses even to a drug may become blunted compared to earlier use, and responses to everyday rewards like food, social interaction, or hobbies can also be diminished. This reduced responsiveness to ordinary rewards can lead to a condition sometimes described as anhedonia, a state in which normal life feels less pleasurable, less interesting, or less motivating than it once did. Of course, this can also perpetuate addiction, as a person will continue to seek out their drug of choice in order to help them feel the satisfaction they're finding it difficult to get from other experiences in their life. Reward responses to the drug itself often become less intense over time as well, however. So people with an addiction frequently report that using their drug of choice doesn't feel as good as it once did. Regardless, their brain has established powerful neural circuitry that identifies the drug and related stimuli as rewarding, so they continue to experience cravings and motivation to use the substance. In addiction science, this is sometimes described as continued wanting, but decreased liking of the drug. Furthermore, adaptations can occur that make the presence of the drug necessary for the nervous system to function normally. This phenomenon is known as dependence, and the result is that removal of the drug from one system can cause withdrawal effects that are often counter to the effects that led the person to start using the drug in the first place. For example, while alcohol can cause reduced inhibition, relaxation, sedation, etc., alcohol withdrawal can produce intense anxiety, insomnia, tremors, and much more. The severity of the withdrawal syndrome depends on the drug and how long and in what doses someone has used it, and it can range from mild to deadly. Of course, withdrawal effects also perpetuate addiction, because re-administering the drug is a tempting way to reduce the discomfort of withdrawal. So, when an addiction forms, it is really created by neurobiological changes that alter the way the brain is working. These changes perpetuate addiction. They make it more likely it will continue by making the person preoccupied with the drug and causing them to crave its use when they don't have it, disrupting the person's ability to inhibit their impulses and making them feel miserable when the drug isn't available. So I hope that overview gave you some insight into what happens in the brain during reward and addiction. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below, and I'll try to answer them.